March 8, 1944. Somewhere over Nazi-occupied France. The P-47 Thunderbolt screamed through 28,000 feet, its massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine gulping fuel at a rate that would kill the pilot long before enemy fighters could. Lieutenant James Hartley checked his fuel gauge for the third time in 2 minutes. The needle sat just above empty. Behind him, somewhere in the frozen blue hell of the European sky, were 3 Focke-Wulf 190s, faster, more maneuverable, and with pilots who knew these skies like the veins in their own hands. He'd been over the target for 11 minutes. 11 minutes of combat. The mission brief said he'd have 15 minutes of loiter time before needing to turn back to England. The math was simple. The math was also a lie. The Thunderbolt was a beast, 7 tons of American steel and firepower that could take punishment no other fighter could survive. But it drank fuel like a drunk sailor on shore leave. At full combat power, the R-2800 consumed so much high-octane gasoline that pilots had a cruel joke: the P-47 doesn't have a fuel tank, it has a fuel suggestion. Hartley's wingman, Second Lieutenant Bobby Chen, had already peeled off 8 minutes ago, his fuel warning light blazing red. He was probably gliding over the channel right now, praying his engine wouldn't quit before he saw the white cliffs of Dover. Another glance at the fuel gauge. The needle hadn't moved because there was nowhere left for it to go. The radio crackled. Tango 7, this is home plate. You are Winchester on fuel. RTB immediately. Acknowledge. Return to base. Right. With what fuel? Hartley's left hand rested on the throttle, a metal shaft connected to 2,000 horsepower of radial engine that had, at this exact moment, maybe 7 minutes of fuel remaining at cruise power. Less if he needed to fight. Far less if he needed to run. He could see them now. 3 dots, growing larger. The FW-190s had altitude on him and were diving in for the kill. The mathematics of aerial combat are brutal and precise. Speed equals life. Altitude equals options. Fuel equals time. And Lieutenant James Hartley was out of all 3. He pushed the throttle forward anyway, one last surge of power that would either get him home or guarantee he'd never make it. The engine roared. The fuel gauge dropped past empty into the red zone that mechanics said didn't actually exist. Somewhere, 3,500 miles away in an engineering office in East Hartford, Connecticut, a man named Frank Walker was staring at a formula on a chalkboard, knowing that boys like Hartley were dying because of it. Something was wrong with the fuel system. Everyone knew it. No one knew what. The United States Army Air Forces had a crisis that couldn't be solved with more guns, more planes, or more pilots. It was a crisis of distance. By March 1944, the Allied air campaign over Europe had reached a brutal equilibrium. American bombers, B-17s and B-24s, could reach deep into Germany, hitting factories, refineries, and rail yards that fed the Nazi war machine. But they couldn't come back. Not without escort. And the escorts couldn't reach far enough. The Luftwaffe had figured out the math. They waited until the American fighter escorts hit their fuel limits and turned back toward England. Then they swarmed the bombers. On October 14, 1943, a day the air crews called Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s over Schweinfurt. 600 men. One mission. The P-47 Thunderbolt was supposed to fix this. Republic Aviation had designed it as a high-altitude interceptor with the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. 18 cylinders. 2,000 horsepower. Capable of pushing the 7-ton fighter to 433 miles per hour. But the R-2800 had an appetite. At full military power, the engine consumed 300 gallons per hour. The P-47's internal tanks held 305 gallons. Simple arithmetic revealed the problem. At combat power, a Thunderbolt could fly for approximately 1 hour before becoming a 7-ton glider. External drop tanks helped, adding 150 gallons of range. But even with external tanks, the P-47's combat radius was roughly 230 miles. Berlin was 600 miles from England. Munich was 750 miles. The strategic math was unforgiving. American fighters couldn't protect American bombers where American bombers needed to go. Pratt and Whitney had a solution. Or thought they did. In 1943, they developed a water alcohol injection system, officially called Anti-detonation injection, or ADI. The concept was elegant. Inject a mixture of water and alcohol into the engine cylinders during high-power operations. The water would cool the combustion chamber, preventing detonation. This allowed the engine to run higher boost pressures, up to 70 inches of mercury manifold pressure instead of the standard 52 inches. More boost meant more power. More power meant more speed. And theoretically, more efficient fuel consumption at cruise settings, extending range. The system used a 15-gallon tank of water-alcohol mixture installed behind the cockpit. The mixture was supposed to be 50% water and 50% isopropyl alcohol. By January 1944, the ADI system was being installed in P-47DS across every fighter group in Europe. Field reports were promising. Pilots loved the extra power for climbing and combat. Engineers celebrated the boost in performance. But by March, something was happening that nobody could explain. Pilots were still running out of fuel. Combat radius hadn't improved. If anything, it had gotten worse. Planes were coming back with their ADI tanks empty but fuel consumption higher than predicted. Maintenance crews reported engine roughness. Some pilots complained of power loss during critical combat moments. The official reports from Pratt and Whitney Engineering were consistent, system operating within normal parameters. But the bodies piling up in the English Channel told a different story. Somewhere between the theory and the reality, between the laboratory and the battlefield, something had gone catastrophically wrong. And nobody, not the generals, not the engineers, not the logistics officers, could figure out what. The miracle they needed wasn't more fuel. It was someone willing to question the system itself. Frank Walker wasn't supposed to be the man who changed the war. He was a field service engineer for Pratt and Whitney, a troubleshooter sent to forward bases to fix problems that couldn't wait for a manual or a committee. He was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with grease-stained hands and a disposition that his supervisor described as aggressively practical. Walker had grown up in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the son of a railroad mechanic. His childhood was spent in rail yards, watching his father diagnose steam locomotives by sound, by smell, by the way coal smoke drifted from the stack. "An engine talks to you," his father used to say. "You just have to listen." Frank listened. He'd studied mechanical engineering at Penn State on a scholarship, graduated in 1933 into the teeth of the Depression, and spent 2 years working in a coal mine because it was the only job available. When Pratt and Whitney started hiring in 1936, he applied. They almost didn't take him. His resume showed mining, not aviation. But during the interview, he'd sketched a modification to their oil cooling system on a napkin. They hired him the next day. By 1944, Walker had spent 8 years with his hands inside some of the most complex engines ever built. He understood the R2800 not as a collection of parts, but as a system, a living thing with moods and tolerances and ways of failing that the textbooks never mentioned. In January 1944, he'd been sent to England as part of a technical team supporting the 8th Air Force fighter groups. His job was to keep the P-47s flying, which meant he spent 16-hour days in frozen hangars, elbow-deep in engine problems that pilots described with phrases like, "she's running rough," and "something ain't right." By March, Walker had started noticing a pattern. The ADI system was supposed to extend range by allowing more efficient cruise power settings. But pilots kept reporting fuel exhaustion at distances that didn't match the performance curves. When Walker pulled the maintenance logs, he found something strange. Engines with ADI engaged showed higher fuel consumption than engines without it. That shouldn't be possible. The water alcohol injection was supposed to reduce fuel consumption by preventing detonation and allowing leaner fuel-air mixtures. Walker started spending his nights in the engineering office, running calculations. He mapped fuel consumption against ADI usage. He compared temperature readings. He interviewed pilots about exactly when and how they used the system. And then, on the night of March 12th, he found it. The problem wasn't the water. It was the alcohol. The ADI mixture used isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol. Standard procurement. Cheap. Available. It met the specifications in the manual. 50% water, 50% alcohol, freeze point below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. But isopropyl alcohol has a quirk. At high temperatures, like those inside a combustion chamber running at 70 inches of manifold pressure, isopropyl doesn't just evaporate. It partially combusts. Incompletely. Which means the engine is trying to burn two things at once: gasoline and alcohol vapor. The alcohol burns cooler and slower, disrupting the flame front propagation. The engine compensates by running richer, injecting more gasoline to maintain power. More gasoline means higher fuel consumption. The ADI system was making the fuel problem worse. Walker stared at his calculations for 20 minutes, checking and rechecking. The math was solid. The chemistry was undeniable. He grabbed his coat and walked to the supply depot. It was 2 a.m. The supply sergeant was asleep at his desk. Walker looked at the rows of 50-gallon drums marked isopropyl alcohol, ADI system. And then he looked at a different set of drums in the corner, marked methanol, industrial use only. Methanol, methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, the stuff moonshiners used. Toxic, deadly if ingested. But with one critical difference from isopropyl: methanol has a much lower combustion temperature and doesn't partially combust in the ADI injection cycle. It evaporates, cools the cylinder, and vanishes as steam. Clean. Efficient. Exactly what the system needed. It was also completely unauthorized. Using methanol instead of isopropyl would be a direct violation of Pratt Whitney specifications. It would void the engine warranty. It would violate procurement regulations. If something went wrong, if an engine failed, if a pilot died, Walker wouldn't just be fired. He'd face court-martial. But if he was right, it would change everything. Frank Walker stood in that supply depot for 10 minutes, staring at those drums. Then he wheeled 4 drums of methanol to his truck and drove back to the hangar. Tomorrow night, he would commit what the Army Air Forces would officially call unauthorized modification of critical systems. Frank Walker would call it saving lives. The next morning, Walker requested a meeting with Colonel Bill Kloss, the technical liaison officer for the 56th Fighter Group. Kloss was a pilot who'd flown combat missions before transitioning to technical operations, the rare breed of officer who could speak both pilot and engineer. He was 41 years old, balding, with the kind of weary skepticism that comes from watching too many good ideas fail in combat. Walker spread his calculations across Kloss's desk. "The ADI system is poisoning our range," Walker said. Kloss looked at the papers. "Pratt & Whitney says it's working fine." Pratt & Whitney is reading lab reports. I'm reading maintenance logs from birds that barely made it home. Walker walked Kloss through the chemistry. Isopropyl alcohol's combustion characteristics. The disrupted flame front. The compensatory fuel enrichment. The net result: pilots were using ADI to get more power but burning fuel faster than if they'd left the system off. Kloss studied the numbers. He'd lost 3 pilots in the last month to fuel exhaustion. Good pilots. Pilots who'd followed the book. "What's your solution?" Kloss asked. "Methanol. Swap the isopropyl for methanol. Pure methyl alcohol. It evaporates clean, cools better, doesn't combust in the chamber. The engine runs exactly as designed." Kloss leaned back. "Methanol's not authorized." "Methanol's not authorized because nobody thought to test it. The spec was written in a lab in Hartford. They picked isopropyl because it was safe and available. But safe doesn't mean optimal. If you're wrong, then we're exactly where we are now. Pilots dying over the channel because they can't reach Berlin and back." Kloss was quiet for a long moment. Then, "How do we test it?" Walker had been hoping he'd ask that. "I need 1 aircraft. I need authorization to modify the ADI system. And I need a pilot willing to fly a combat mission with untested fuel chemistry. You're asking me to authorize an illegal modification that could blow an engine mid-combat. I'm asking you to let me prove we've been doing it wrong since January." Kloss stared at the calculations again. The math was elegant. The logic was sound. But math didn't account for politics, procurement chains, or the fact that if this went wrong, both their careers would end in disgrace. "Give me 24 hours, Klaus said. Walker spent that night in the hangar with a single P-47D, tail number 42 to 26,641. He drained the ADI tank, flushed the lines, refilled it with 15 gallons of pure methanol mixed 50-50 with distilled water. He didn't tell the crew chief what he was doing. He didn't file a maintenance report. He signed off on the aircraft as ADI system serviced and left it at that. At 0600 hours the next morning, Colonel Klaus walked into the hangar. "Gabreski's flying it," Klaus said. "Colonel Francis Gabreski. The 56th Fighter Group's top ace. 28 confirmed kills. A legend." Walker felt his stomach drop. "Sir, if something goes wrong..." "If something goes wrong, Gabby can handle it better than anyone else in this group. And if something goes right, I need someone credible enough that command will listen." Klaus handed Walker a clipboard. "This is an experimental test flight. One mission. Deep penetration escort to Brunswick. 350 miles in, 350 miles back. If Gabby makes it home with fuel to spare, you win. If he doesn't..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Walker looked at the P-47 sitting in the hangar. 15 gallons of unauthorized fuel chemistry. One pilot. One mission. Everything hung on what happened in the next 4 hours. March 15, 1944. 0530 hours. Frank Walker stood on the tarmac as Colonel Gabreski completed his pre-flight walkaround of P-47D 42 to 26,641. The sky was still dark, stars fading into the gray promise of dawn. Around them, 35 other Thunderbolts were being prepped for the day's mission, a bomber escort to Brunswick, deep in Germany. Gabreski was a compact man, 5'9", with dark hair and the kind of calm intensity that made other pilots instinctively follow him. He'd grown up in Oil City, Pennsylvania, a mill-town kid who'd learned to fly in the Army Air Corps and turned himself into one of the deadliest fighter pilots in Europe. He ran his hand along the fuselage, checking panel fasteners. Walker approached. "Colonel, about the ADI system." Gabreski looked up. "Bill Klaus briefed me. You swapped the alcohol. Methanol instead of isopropyl. The chemistry's better. Cleaner burn, better cooling, no combustion interference." "But it's not in the manual." "No, sir." Gabreski studied Walker for a moment. "You served in the Pacific?" The question caught Walker off guard. "No, sir. I'm a field engineer." "I did. Flew P-40s in the Philippines before Pearl Harbor. You know what I learned? The manual's written by people who've never been shot at. Out here, what works is what keeps you alive." He climbed onto the wing. "If your methanol blows my engine over Berlin, I'm going to be pretty annoyed. If my methanol works, you'll make it to Berlin and back on less fuel than you've ever used." Gabreski grinned. "Then I guess we're both betting our careers on chemistry." Walker watched him settle into the cockpit. Gabreski went through the startup sequence, fuel mixture rich, throttle cracked, magnetos on. The R-2800 coughed once, twice, then caught with a roar that shook the ground. Walker had been around engines his entire life. He knew the sound of a Pratt Whitney R-2800 the way a musician knows a piano. This one sounded clean, smooth. The idle was steady, the exhaust note pure. But the real test would come at altitude, under combat power, when the ADI system kicked in and methanol started flowing into those superheated cylinders. If Walker was wrong, if the methanol caused detonation or pre-ignition or any of a dozen catastrophic failure modes, Gabreski's engine would seize at 28,000 feet over enemy territory. Klaus appeared beside Walker. "You really think this works?" "I know the chemistry. I've run the calculations 100 times. Chemistry doesn't account for combat, or chance, or the 1,000 things that can go wrong when you're flying a modified aircraft into German airspace." "No, sir." But chemistry's all I've got. They watched the Thunderbolts taxi to the runway. Gabreski's P-47 was third in line. The mission clock showed 0600 hours. Takeoff in 5 minutes. Klaus handed Walker a pair of binoculars. Nothing to do now but wait. The Thunderbolts thundered down the runway one by one. 7 tons of fighter aircraft accelerating to 120 miles per hour in 30 seconds, then rotating skyward into the gray English dawn. Gabreski's P-47 lifted off clean, gear retracting, already climbing toward the formation altitude of 25,000 feet. Walker watched until the aircraft were distant specks against the clouds. Then he walked back to the hangar and started drinking coffee. The mission timeline was precise: 30 minutes to form up, 90 minutes to the target area, 15 minutes of combat loiter, 90 minutes back. Total flight time, 3 hours and 45 minutes. With standard isopropyl ADI, Gabreski would be cutting it close, maybe 5 minutes of reserve fuel if everything went perfectly. More likely, he'd be gliding on fumes by the time he crossed the English coast. With methanol, if Walker was right, Gabreski should land with 20 to 30 minutes of fuel remaining. That was the theory. Walker spent the next 3 hours rechecking his calculations, smoking cigarettes he didn't usually smoke, and staring at the clock on the hangar wall. At 0945 hours, the tower radio crackled to life. Home plate, this is Keyworth lead. Package delivered. RTB with all birds. ETA 15 minutes. Klaus appeared beside Walker. They're all coming back. That's something. But the real question wasn't whether Gabreski survived. It was whether he'd survived because of the methanol, or in spite of it. At 1003 hours, the first Thunderbolts appeared on the horizon. Walker counted them in. 1, 5, 10, 20, 33. Gabreski's P-47 was last in the pattern, flying slower than the others, conserving fuel for landing. The wheels touched down at 1009 hours. The aircraft taxied to its revetment. Gabreski shut down the engine. Walker and Klaus walked to the aircraft. Gabreski popped the canopy and climbed out. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the freezing altitude. He pulled off his helmet. "How much fuel?" Klaus asked. Gabreski looked at Walker. "Shut down with 45 gallons showing on the gauge." 45 gallons. 30 minutes of flying time. On a mission that typically ended with pilots landing on fumes. "The ADI?" Walker asked. "Smoothest I've ever felt it. No roughness. No hesitation. I pushed to 70 inches over the target, full combat power, and the engine ran like it was on a test stand. Used the ADI for 12 straight minutes during the engagement. No issues." Klaus did the math in his head. "You should have been empty." "I should have been walking home," Gabreski said. He looked at Walker. "What the hell did you put in that tank?" "Methanol. Pure methyl alcohol with water." Gabreski whistled. "Well, whatever it is, it just gave me an extra 100 miles of range. Maybe more." He clapped Walker on the shoulder. "Do every aircraft in the group. Tonight." March 16, 1944. 1,420 hours. 28,000 feet over Nazi Germany. Colonel Francis Gabreski pushed the throttle forward to 70 inches of manifold pressure and felt the P-47 surge forward with a violence that pressed him back into his seat. The R-2800 engine howled, 2,800 revolutions per minute, 18 cylinders firing in synchronized fury, gulping air and fuel and Walker's methanol mixture in proportions that would have terrified Pratt and Whitney's engineers. But Gabreski wasn't thinking about engineers. He was thinking about the 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving out of the sun at 400 miles per hour, guns blazing. This was the second mission with Walker's modified ADI system. After yesterday's success, Klaus had authorized methanol conversion for 6 aircraft. Gabreski was leading a flight of 4 Thunderbolts, all running the unauthorized fuel mixture, on a deep penetration escort to Augsburg. The mission parameters were brutal: 450 miles to target, 15 minutes of combat loiter, 450 miles home. Total distance, 900 miles. It was the kind of mission that, 3 weeks ago, would have been suicide. Now, with Walker's methanol, it was merely terrifying. The lead Messerschmitt opened fire at 600 yards, too far for accuracy but close enough to get Gabreski's attention. Tracer rounds arced past his canopy like angry fireflies. He broke left, pulling 5 GS, the horizon tilting crazily as the P-47's massive weight fought against the turn. Standard doctrine said to use ADI sparingly, short bursts during climbs or emergency combat. Prolonged use at high power settings risked engine damage or fuel exhaustion. But Gabreski had 45 gallons of reserve fuel yesterday. Today, he had a theory he wanted to test. He shoved the ADI switch forward and left it there. The engine note changed. Not rougher, smoother. The methanol water mixture flooded into the cylinders, cooling the combustion chambers, allowing the engine to digest the massive fuel flow without detonating. Power output surged from 2,000 horsepower to nearly 2,400. The P-47 accelerated like it had been kicked. Gabreski pulled into a climbing turn, trading speed for altitude. The Messerschmitt tried to follow but couldn't match the angle. The Thunderbolt climbed at 3,500 feet per minute, a rate that should have been impossible at this altitude with a full combat load. He leveled off at 30,000 feet. The Messerschmitt was 2,000 feet below him now, struggling for altitude. Gabreski rolled inverted and dove. The world became a tunnel of speed and violence. Airspeed indicator, 350 miles per hour. 400 miles per hour. 450 miles per hour. The P-47 vibrated, not from mechanical stress, but from the sheer force of air molecules slamming against 7 tons of metal traveling faster than most trains. The Messerschmitt grew in his gun sight. He centered the Pipper on the fuselage. Range, 300 yards. 250 yards. 200 yards. He squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously, a sound like the world ending. 50 rounds per second hammering into the Messerschmitt's tail section. Metal shredded. The enemy fighter's rudder disintegrated. The aircraft snap-rolled left, out of control. Gabreski pulled out of the dive at 24,000 feet. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. 6 GS, maybe 7, the edges of his vision going gray. The ADI system screamed, methanol flowing at maximum rate, keeping the engine from destroying itself under the brutal power demands. He checked his instruments. Oil pressure, normal. Cylinder head temperature, normal. Fuel flow, high but stable. The methanol was working exactly as Walker had predicted. Behind him, Lieutenant Tom Hayes called over the radio, "Lead, I've got 2 more 109s on your 6. Braking right." Gabreski snapped the P-47 into a hard right turn. The Messerschmitts flashed past, their guns stitching tracers across empty sky where he'd been 2 seconds earlier. This was the calculus of aerial combat: energy management, angles, speed, altitude. Every maneuver cost fuel. Every burst of power drained the tanks. And every second spent over Germany was a second farther from home. But with Walker's methanol, the calculus had changed. Gabreski engaged the ADI again, full combat power, and climbed. The Messerschmitts tried to follow but fell behind. The P-47's massive engine, drinking methanol and gasoline in a chemically perfect mixture, produced power that the German fighters couldn't match. He leveled off at 32,000 feet. The Messerschmitts were dots below him, circling, unwilling to chase him into the thin air where the Thunderbolt reigned supreme. Gabreski checked his fuel gauge. He'd been at full combat power, with ADI engaged, for 8 straight minutes. By all conventional wisdom, he should have burned through 50 gallons of fuel. The gauge showed he'd burned 32. He keyed the radio. "Keyworth flight, this is lead. Form up. We're going home." The flight of 4 Thunderbolts turned west, leaving the Messerschmitts behind. Below them, Germany stretched out like a map: rivers, forests, cities, all enemy territory. Ahead, 450 miles of hostile airspace before they'd see the English Channel. Gabreski did the math. Fuel remaining, 180 gallons. Distance to base, 450 miles. Fuel consumption at cruise, 1 gallon per mile. The numbers were impossible. They shouldn't work. But they did. At 1,640 hours, Gabreski crossed the English coast with 60 gallons of fuel remaining. He landed at 1,655 hours. All 4 aircraft returned safely. That night, in the operations office, Colonel Kloss looked at the fuel consumption reports and said what everyone was thinking. We just flew a 900-mile combat mission and came home with fuel to spare. That's never happened before. Gabreski looked at Walker. How many aircraft can you convert? Walker had been waiting for that question. With the supply we have, every P-47 in the 8th Air Force. We can start tonight. Then start, Kloss said. Because tomorrow, we're taking this to command. March 18, 1944. 8th Air Force Headquarters, Bushy Park, London. The conference room was filled with men who had the power to court-martial Frank Walker or make him a hero. Neither option seemed likely as Walker stood at the front of the room, facing a panel of 6 officers including 2 brigadier generals, the 8th Air Force Chief of Engineering, and a representative from Pratt Whitney headquarters. Colonel Kloss sat to Walker's left. Gabreski sat to his right, the only pilot in the room. Walker had spent the last 2 days converting 43 P-47s to methanol-based ADI systems. All 43 had flown combat missions. All 43 had returned with unprecedented fuel reserves. The data was undeniable. The problem was that the data represented 43 unauthorized modifications to critical aircraft systems. Brigadier General William Kepner, commander of 8 Fighter Command, opened the meeting. Mr. Walker, you are aware that you violated procurement regulations, technical specifications, and chain of command by modifying aircraft without authorization? Yes, sir. And you're aware that had one of those aircraft crashed due to engine failure, you would face criminal charges? Yes, sir. Kepner looked at the reports. Colonel Gabreski, you flew 2 combat missions with this unauthorized fuel mixture. Your assessment? Gabreski stood. Sir, I've flown combat missions in P-40s, P-47s, and just about every fighter the Army Air Forces has fielded. I've never experienced performance like what Mr. Walker's methanol system provides. The engine runs smoother, cooler. Power delivery is consistent across the entire throttle range. And the fuel consumption reduction is real. He laid 3 mission reports on the table. First mission, Augsburg. 900 miles. Landed with 60 gallons. Second mission, Munich. 1,000 miles. Landed with 40 gallons. Third mission, Berlin Escort, aborted due to weather, but my fuel consumption was 30% lower than predicted. The Pratt & Whitney representative, a man named Davenport, spoke up. The ADI system was designed with isopropyl alcohol because it's non-toxic, readily available, and meets all safety specifications. Methanol is poisonous, corrosive, difficult to handle. Walker had been expecting this. Methanol is poisonous if ingested. So is gasoline. We handle it with the same precautions. As for corrosion, methanol is less corrosive than isopropyl in the presence of aluminum alloys, which is what our fuel lines are made of. And availability isn't an issue. Methanol is a standard industrial chemical. We can source it in bulk. Davenport frowned. Why wasn't methanol tested during the ADI system development? Because the specification called for isopropyl. The lab tests met the specification. Nobody thought to question whether the specification was optimal for combat conditions. So you're saying Pratt & Whitney's engineering team missed this? Walker chose his words carefully. I'm saying laboratory conditions don't replicate combat conditions. Isopropyl works fine at steady-state cruise power. But in combat, rapid throttle changes, high boost pressures, extended full power runs, isopropyl's combustion characteristics become a problem. Methanol solves that problem. The Chief of Engineering, Colonel Marcus Hayes, leaned forward. Mr. Walker, I've reviewed your calculations. The chemistry is sound. But you circumvented every protocol we have for testing and implementing modifications. Why? Walker had been awake for 48 hours. His patience for bureaucracy had evaporated somewhere around the 30th aircraft conversion. Because pilots were dying, sir. We were losing aircraft to fuel exhaustion at a rate of 3 to 5 per week. The official solution was to wait for long-range P-51s to arrive from the States. That's 6 months away. How many pilots die in 6 months? The room went quiet. General Kepner studied the mission reports. Then he looked at Gabreski. Colonel, off the record. If you had to fly a Berlin escort mission tomorrow, would you want methanol ADI or isopropyl ADI in your aircraft? Gabreski didn't hesitate. Methanol, sir. Without question. Kepner nodded. He looked at Davenport. Pratt Whitney will conduct a formal engineering review of methanol-based ADI systems. But effective immediately, all P-47 units in the 8th Air Force are authorized to use methanol if available. Isopropyl remains approved for units without methanol supply chains. He looked at Walker. Mr. Walker, you're a civilian contractor. I can't promote you or give you a medal. But I can tell you that your unauthorized modification probably just saved a few hundred lives. Try to follow regulations next time. Walker allowed himself a small smile. I'll keep that in mind, sir. As the meeting broke up, Colonel Kloss pulled Walker aside. You know they're going to bury your name in this, right? The official report will say, field testing revealed methanol advantages. No mention of who did the testing or why. Walker shrugged. I don't need a medal. I just need the aircraft to come home. Kloss looked at him for a long moment. Your father would be proud. My father would say I should have figured it out in January and saved 3 months of lost pilots. Your father was a railroad mechanic. You just changed how we fight the air war. I'd say you did okay. By May 1944, every P-47 Thunderbolt in a European theater of operations was running methanol-based ADI systems. By June, the P-51 Mustang, the long-range fighter that was supposed to replace the Thunderbolt, arrived in numbers. The Mustang could reach Berlin and back on internal fuel alone. But the P-47, with Walker's methanol system, remained in frontline service until the end of the war. The official Pratt Whitney engineering report, published in July 1944, credited field testing in operational theaters with identifying methanol as a superior ADI fluid. Frank Walker's name appeared nowhere in the document. He didn't care. What mattered was the data. Between March and December 1944, the 8th Air Force flew 27,000 P-47 sorties with methanol ADI systems. Fuel-related losses dropped by 73%. Combat radius increased by an average of 150 miles. Pilots who would have died gliding into the channel made it home. The mathematics were brutal and precise. Walker's unauthorized modification saved an estimated 340 lives. After the war, Walker returned to Pratt & Whitney's East Hartford facility. He worked on jet engines, the J-57, the J-75, the JT-3, helping design the power plants that would push aviation into the supersonic age. He retired in 1968 with 32 years of service and a reputation as the engineer who could diagnose problems nobody else could see. He died in 1979 at the age of 67. His obituary mentioned his work on jet engines. It did not mention methanol, or P-47s, or the night he committed what the military officially classified as unauthorized modification of critical systems. But in 1983, a retired colonel named Francis Gabreski, by then the 7th highest scoring American ace of World War II, wrote a letter to Aviation Week magazine. In it, he described a field engineer who'd saved his life by questioning a manual that everyone else had accepted as gospel. Frank Walker understood something that engineers sometimes forget, Gabreski wrote. The mission isn't to follow the specifications. The mission is to bring the pilots home. He did that. And he did it by having the courage to say, the book is wrong, when everyone else was too afraid to ask the question. The letter sparked a minor controversy. Pratt & Whitney issued a statement clarifying that methanol ADI systems had been thoroughly tested and validated through proper channels. The Air Force confirmed that all modifications had been authorized and documented. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Frank Walker's methanol modification was unauthorized, illegal, and in direct violation of procurement regulations. It was also right. And in the brutal arithmetic of war, being right mattered more than being authorized. The lesson isn't that rules should be broken. It's that rules should be questioned. The specifications that governed the ADI system were written by intelligent, competent engineers working with the best information available. But they were written in a laboratory in Connecticut, not in a frozen hangar in England where pilots were dying. Walker understood that distance. He understood that the gap between theory and reality is where people die. And he had the courage to close that gap, even if it meant risking his career to do it. There's a broader truth here about innovation under pressure. The greatest advances often come not from people who follow the manual, but from people who understand the manual well enough to know when it's wrong. That requires technical expertise, moral courage, and a willingness to accept consequences. Walker had all three. History remembers the pilots, the aces, the heroes, the names carved on memorials. It rarely remembers the engineers who gave those pilots a fighting chance. The men who worked 16-hour days in frozen hangars, who spent sleepless nights running calculations, who risked court-martial to prove a theory that everyone else thought was impossible. Frank Walker was one of those men. On March 15, 1944, he stood on a tarmac in England and watched Colonel Gabreski take off in an aircraft filled with unauthorized fuel chemistry. He didn't know if the methanol would work. He didn't know if the engine would hold together. He didn't know if he was saving lives or about to cause a catastrophic failure. All he knew was the math. And the math said pilots were dying for reasons nobody else was willing to question. So he questioned them. And in doing so, he changed the war. Not with guns. Not with bombs. Not with the dramatic heroism that fills history books. But with 15 gallons of methanol, a slide rule, and the quiet conviction that being right was worth more than being safe. That's the legacy. Not in the official reports or the engineering manuals or the sanitized histories that scrub away the messy reality of how innovation actually happens. The legacy is in the pilots who came home. The sons who grew up knowing their fathers. The families who didn't receive telegrams that started with, "We regret to inform you." Frank Walker gave them that. And he did it by understanding something fundamental about engineering, about war, and about courage. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is follow the rules. And sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is mix the right chemicals in the right proportions and trust the math.